April 1, 1945. The beaches of Okinawa. American forces hit the Higuchi landing zones, expecting the familiar terror of Pacific night fighting. Japanese infiltrators slipping through darkness like ghosts, striking with bayonets and grenades before vanishing back into black sugarcane fields. For 3 years, the night had belonged to the enemy. Every American infantry commander knew the drill. When darkness fell, you prayed. Your centuries would hear footsteps before feeling cold steel. But on this island, something had changed. Hidden among the standard-issue rifles of the 96th Infantry Division were 150 weapons that would rewrite the rules of nocturnal warfare. The carbine T3, a standard 30 caliber rifle mounted with an infrared scope and lamp. Technology so new that most soldiers had never seen anything like it. 70-yard effective range in pitch darkness. Green-tinted images of human silhouettes where there should have been nothing but void. The Japanese High Command had built their entire Okinawa strategy around night infiltration. Lieutenant General Ushijima's 32nd Army planned to bleed American forces through relentless darkness attacks, exploiting the one-advantage terrain, and tradition had always guaranteed them. They had no idea the Americans could see in the dark. What happened next would account for 30% of all small arms kills in the opening week from just 0.1% of American weapons on the island. The morning of April 1 brought deceptive calm to Okinawa's western beaches. Corporal James Carter crouched behind a low stone wall southeast of the Higuchi landing zones, watching his machine gun crew dig fighting positions into the coral hard ground. The 96th Infantry Division had come ashore, expecting fierce resistance. But the Japanese had offered nothing more than scattered artillery fire. Too easy, Carter thought. The enemy was waiting for something. Carter had fought through the Philippines and knew the Japanese playbook by heart. During daylight, American firepower ruled: artillery, airstrikes, overwhelming small arms fire. But when darkness fell, the advantage shifted. Japanese infiltrators would slip through American lines like water through a sieve, appearing suddenly with bayonets and grenades before melting back into the night. At Luzon, Carter had lost 3 men to a single Japanese squad that materialized from nowhere at 2 in the morning. The ridge Carter's section now defended offered commanding views across 200 yards of sugarcane fields that stretched toward Japanese positions near Shuri. Perfect infiltration terrain. The canetalk stood 8 feet high, creating natural corridors that would hide movement until the enemy reached spitting distance. Carter studied the approaches through his binoculars, marking the most likely avenues. When night came, this would become a killing field. The only question was who would do the killing. Sergeant Miller approached with something Carter had never seen before. The weapon looked like a standard M2 carbine, but a strange telescopic device was mounted above the barrel, connected by thick cables to a heavy backpack battery. A sealed beam lamp housing jutted from the left side of the stock like a mechanical eye. "This is it," Miller said, setting the weapon down carefully. The T3 Carbine, infrared scope, and lamp. "They say it lets you see in the dark." Carter lifted the weapon, immediately noticing the weight difference. His standard carbine weighed 6 pounds. This system felt nearly twice as heavy. The battery pack alone weighed 12 pounds of lead-acid cells and wiring. He peered through the scope's eyepiece, seeing only darkness in the green-tinted view. "How's it work?" Miller demonstrated, flicking a switch on the battery pack. The lamp housing glowed with invisible infrared light. Through the scope, the sugarcane field suddenly appeared in ghostly green detail. Individual stalks, clearly visible 70 yards away. Carter's breath caught. It was like having cat eyes. Effective range is about 70 yards in good conditions, Miller explained. Rain or fog cuts that down. Battery lasts 6 to 8 hours if you're careful. There's only about 150 of these things on the whole island. Carter shouldered the weapon, scanning the field through the scope. The green world revealed details invisible to the naked eye, broken stalks where someone might have passed, slight depressions in the ground, the exact spacing between cane rows. For the first time since landing on Okinawa, he felt optimistic about the coming night. Who else gets these? Maybe one per company if we're lucky. Command wants them concentrated in sectors most likely to see infiltration. Miller gestured toward the sugars fields, places like this. As darkness approached, Carter positioned himself 30 yards back from the ridge crest where the lamp's glow wouldn't silhouette his position. His assistant gunner, Private Walsh, crouched beside him as spotter. The machine gun crew took positions 15 yards to the right, ready to engage targets Carter illuminated. The first hours passed quietly. Carter swept the scope across the sugarcane fields methodically, watching for movement. The infrared lamp painted everything in that eerie green glow, but the field remained still. Behind them, the rest of the company settled into defensive positions, unaware they had gained technological superiority over an enemy that had owned the night for 3 years. At 11:30, Walsh nudged Carter's shoulder and pointed toward the eastern edge of the field. Through the scope, Carter spotted them immediately, 5 figures moving in single file between the cane rows approximately 80 yards out. Japanese infiltrators, each carrying a rifle and what looked like satchel charges. Carter's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment when darkness would either belong to the enemy or reveal them as targets. He tracked the lead figure through the scope, watching the squad navigate between the stalks with practiced stealth. They moved like shadows, crouched low, pausing every few steps to listen. The lead infiltrator emerged from the cane into open ground at 60 yards, exactly where Carter had predicted. Perfect range. Carter flicked off the safety and centered the reticle on the man's chest. The green image showed every detail. Uniform, equipment, the concentrated expression of someone who believed he remained invisible. Carter squeezed the trigger. The carbine bucked against his shoulder, the muzzle flash momentarily overwhelming the scope's green image. Through the afterglow, he saw the lead infiltrator crumple. The other 4 froze for a split second, long enough for Carter to shift aim and fire again. Machine gun. Traverse left, Carter called. The .30 caliber opened up, raking the area where the remaining infiltrators had taken cover. Muzzle flashes erupted from the cane field as the Japanese returned fire. But their shots went high, aimed at where they thought the Americans might be rather than where they actually were. Within 30 seconds, the firefight ended. Carter swept the scope across the killing ground, counting 4 motionless forms. The 5th had vanished back into the cane, but blood trails visible through the infrared suggested he wouldn't make it far. Walsh stared at the bodies. Jesus, Jim, they never knew what hit them. Carter felt a surge of vindication mixed with grim satisfaction. For years, American infantry had endured the psychological torture of knowing the enemy could strike from darkness while they remained blind. Tonight, that advantage had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. But as he continued scanning the fields, Carter noticed something troubling. Moisture was beginning to bead on the scope lens from the humid Okinawa air. The lamp's reflection off wet cane leaves created confusing shadows and false images. Weather was going to be a factor. Around 1 in the morning, light rain began falling. Carter watched his effective range shrink from 70 yards to perhaps 50 as water droplets scattered the infrared beam. The green world became hazier. Details blurred. When the next infiltration attempt came, and he knew it would, conditions would be far more challenging. The technological edge that had seemed so decisive was revealing itself as fragile, dependent on weather, battery life, and mechanical reliability. Carter understood now that this weapon wouldn't win the battle for Okinawa. But for a few critical hours each night, it might shift the odds just enough to keep his men alive. As dawn approached and the rain intensified, Carter switched off the infrared system to preserve battery power. The green world vanished, leaving only darkness and the sound of water dripping from sugarcane stalks. Tomorrow night would bring new challenges, new adaptations, new tests of whether American technology could overcome Japanese tactics. The night belonged to no one yet. 18 months earlier, Captain William Garstang had stood in a laboratory at Fort Belvoir, staring at a collection of components that would either revolutionize infantry warfare or prove to be an expensive dead end. The sealed beam lamp borrowed from automobile headlights. The telescopic sight adapted from sniper rifles. The 6-volt battery pack that weighed as much as a mortar round. The challenge was not whether each piece worked individually. It was whether they could function together under combat conditions. The problem had been haunting American commanders since Guadalcanal. Japanese troops excelled at night infiltration, slipping through defensive lines to attack command posts, supply depots, and artillery positions. Traditional countermeasures, flares, searchlights, star shells, revealed American positions as much as they illuminated the enemy. What the infantry needed was a way to see without being seen. Garstang's solution centered on infrared light, invisible to the naked eye, but detectable through specially designed optics. The concept was elegant. Mount an infrared lamp alongside a scope that could convert invisible light into visible images. Then attach both to a weapon platform accurate enough for close-range night fighting. The .30 caliber carbine proved ideal, light enough for extended carrying, reliable in humid conditions, and firing a round with sufficient stopping power for engagements under 70 yards. The technical specifications revealed both promise and limitations. The infrared lamp produced a beam effective to approximately 70 yards in clear conditions, powered by a 12 PB battery pack worn like a rucksack. The scope converted reflected infrared light into a green-tinted image clear enough to identify human targets. Total system weight reached 14 pounds when fully loaded, more than double a standard carbine, but still manageable for trained operators. Development accelerated through 1943 as reports from the Pacific Theater emphasized the growing infiltration threat. At Bougainville, Japanese night attacks had penetrated American positions repeatedly, forcing exhausted troops to maintain constant vigilance. At Saipan, infiltrators had reached artillery batteries, destroying guns and killing crews in their sleep. The psychological impact was enormous. American soldiers feared darkness as much as they did enemy artillery. By March 17, 1944, Garstein had convinced the Ordnance Corps to approve limited procurement. The initial contract called for 1,700 units, designated the carbine caliber 30 TT3. Inland Manufacturing received the production order, tasking their engineers with converting standard M2 carbines into infrared-equipped night fighting weapons. The first production units revealed manufacturing challenges that laboratory testing had not anticipated. The infrared scope required precise alignment with the lamp housing, a tolerance of millimeters that proved difficult to maintain on a factory floor. Battery connections corroded in humid conditions. Lamp filaments broke under recoil stress. Of the initial 1,700 units contracted, only 811 reached acceptable quality standards before contract termination. Training protocols developed in parallel with production. The Engineer Board established a 5-day course at Fort Lewis, teaching operators to maintain battery voltage, position lamp housings to minimize reflection, and coordinate with support teams during night engagements. The doctrine emphasized teamwork. One soldier operated the weapon while a spotter identified targets, and a third maintained communications with supporting machine guns and mortars. The system's limitations became apparent during field testing. Rain reduced effective range to 50 yards or less as water droplets scattered the infrared beam. Fog could eliminate visibility entirely. Battery life rarely exceeded 6 hours under field conditions, requiring careful power management during extended operations. The weight penalty forced operators to abandon other equipment, creating logistics complications. Despite these constraints, early test results proved encouraging. Night engagements that previously resulted in American casualties shifted decisively in favor of the equipped units. Japanese infiltrators, accustomed to invisible movement, found themselves clearly visible to American gunners. The psychological advantage reversed almost completely. Enemy soldiers began avoiding areas where infrared-equipped teams were known to operate. By early 1945, approximately 200 T3 carbines had reached Pacific Theater units concentrated in sectors expected to face heavy infiltration pressure. The weapons accompanied the 10th Army to Okinawa, distributed to rifle companies defending vulnerable approaches and communication lines. Each weapon represented a significant investment in training, logistics, and tactical doctrine. The deployment strategy reflected hard-learned lessons from previous campaigns. Rather than dispersing the weapons broadly, commanders concentrated them in positions where Japanese infiltration was most likely ridgelines overlooking approach routes, gaps between defensive positions, communication centers, and supply dumps. The goal was not to equip every soldier with night vision, but to create killing zones where infiltrators could be detected and engaged before reaching their objectives. Carter's sector southeast of Shuri represented exactly the type of terrain where the T3 carbine could prove decisive. The sugarcane fields provided excellent cover for infiltrating troops during daylight reconnaissance, but became death traps once American gunners could see through darkness. The slight elevation advantage allowed the infrared beam to reach its maximum effective range without obstruction. The tactical doctrine emphasized patience and fire discipline. Operators were trained to observe movement patterns before engaging, identifying the size and composition of infiltrating forces. Premature firing could alert other enemy units or reveal the position to Japanese observers. The most effective technique involved tracking infiltrators to predetermined killing zones where supporting weapons could engage simultaneously. Weather remained the system's greatest vulnerability. Okinawa's climate during April and May combined high humidity with frequent rainfall conditions that severely degraded infrared performance. Operators learned to position lamp housings to minimize reflection off wet surfaces. Adjust power settings to compensate for atmospheric interference and coordinate with conventional weapons when visibility dropped below acceptable levels. The industrial capacity required to produce 1,700 infrared carbines had stretched American manufacturing capabilities in 1944. Each scope required hand-fitted optical components. Battery packs demanded specialized chemical expertise. Lamp housings needed precision metalwork. The production bottlenecks that limited delivery to 800 units reflected broader challenges in transitioning laboratory concepts to mass-produced weapons. As Carter adjusted his position on the ridge, checking battery voltage and cleaning moisture from the scope lens, he embodied the culmination of 2 years of development work. The weapon in his hands represented thousands of engineering hours, millions of dollars in research funding, and the concentrated effort of multiple military branches. Whether those investments would prove worthwhile depended on the next few hours of darkness and the skill of soldiers who had trained for 5 days with equipment that might revolutionize infantry warfare. The Japanese forces moving through the sugarcane fields below had no knowledge of the technological advantage now arrayed against them. No understanding that their most reliable tactical asset had been compromised by invisible light and American ingenuity. The rain that began on April 3 transformed the Okinawan landscape into a nightmare for infrared operations. Carter watched through his scope as water droplets accumulated on every surface, turning the sugarcane field into a maze of false reflections. What had been clear 70-yard visibility 2 nights earlier now shrank to barely 40 yards of usable range. The infrared beams scattered off wet leaves and stalks, creating phantom movements that could mask real infiltrators or trigger unnecessary engagements. Colonel Harami Yahara studied intelligence reports from his command post near Shuri, noting the sudden shift in American night defensive capabilities. Japanese infiltration teams that had operated with virtual impunity for 3 years were reporting catastrophic losses during nocturnal operations. Entire squads vanished without trace, their positions marked only by blood trails leading back toward American lines. The pattern suggested a fundamental change in enemy tactics or equipment. Yahara's analytical mind dissected the problem methodically. American defensive fire had become preternaturally accurate in darkness, engaging Japanese troops at ranges where visual contact should have been impossible. The timing of engagements suggested prior detection rather than random firing. Most troubling, American positions that had been vulnerable to infiltration throughout the Pacific Campaign were now proving nearly impregnable during night operations. The solution Yahara devised exploited the limitations inherent in any technological system. Instead of single infiltration teams operating independently, he ordered coordinated attacks using multiple small groups approaching from different directions simultaneously. If the Americans possessed some form of night observation device, it could only cover limited sectors. Overwhelming those sectors with simultaneous infiltration attempts would either reveal the nature of the American advantage or render it ineffective through saturation. Carter felt the Japanese adaptation acutely during the night of April 7. Through his scope, he detected the first infiltration group at 60 yards, moving cautiously through the eastern approach. As he prepared to engage, Walsh spotted additional movement to the west. Another Squad advancing through parallel cane rows. Before Carter could process this development, muzzle flashes erupted from a third direction as Japanese troops opened suppressive fire from positions they had occupied during daylight hours. The infrared scope could only observe one sector at a time. While Carter engaged the eastern group, the western infiltrators advanced unchallenged. The coordinated attack forced impossible choices. Engage the closest threat while others maneuvered freely or attempt to track multiple targets while accomplishing neither mission effectively. The technological advantage that had seemed overwhelming suddenly felt inadequate against adaptive enemy tactics. Battery logistics compounded operational difficulties. Each power pack required careful management to maintain voltage levels throughout extended operations. Carter learned to switch the system on only when movement was detected, preserving power for critical engagements. But this conservation approach created gaps in surveillance that Japanese infiltrators quickly exploited. Teams that approached during power-down intervals could advance to grenade range before being detected. The weight penalty imposed by the infrared system created additional complications. Carter's standard load of ammunition, water, and equipment already strained his physical capacity during extended operations. The 14 pounds carbine system, when added to the OIST's 12 pounds battery pack, forced difficult decisions about what other equipment to carry. Reduced ammunition loads meant fewer rounds available during extended firefights. Less water increased fatigue. During Okinawa's humid nights, maintenance requirements proved more demanding than training had suggested. The optical components required constant cleaning to prevent moisture accumulation. Battery terminals corroded rapidly in the tropical environment, creating intermittent power failures at critical moments. Lamp filaments stressed by repeated thermal cycling and weapon recoil failed with increasing frequency. As operations continued, each maintenance task required time and attention that diverted focus from primary mission requirements. The Japanese response evolved throughout the first week of April. Infiltration teams began carrying mirrors and reflective materials, creating false heat signatures to confuse infrared detection. Approach routes shifted to exploit weather conditions. Attacks during heavy rain or fog when infrared effectiveness dropped significantly. Timing changed from the traditional pre-dawn infiltrations to operations during weather fronts when atmospheric conditions degraded American technological advantages. Carter's most challenging engagement occurred during the early morning hours of April 9. Heavy rain had reduced his effective range to approximately 35 yards when he detected movement in the sugarcane field. Through the degraded green image, he counted at least 12 infiltrators moving in 3 separate groups toward predetermined positions. The tactical situation demanded immediate engagement, but the weather conditions made target identification extremely difficult. The first burst from Carter's carbine struck the lead infiltrator at 40 yards, the maximum range under current conditions. The remaining Japanese immediately dispersed using the cane stalks and rain as concealment while advancing toward the American positions. Carter tracked individual targets through the scope, but the scattered reflections from wet surfaces made precise aim nearly impossible. His shots were effective but not decisive, wounding rather than eliminating threats. Walsh suddenly grabbed Carter's shoulder and pointed toward the right flank. A Japanese squad had bypassed the infrared surveillance entirely, approaching through a gully that offered concealment from the elevated observation position. The infiltrators had studied American positions during daylight reconnaissance, identifying blind spots in the defensive layout that technological advantages could not compensate for. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of the infrared carbine system. Carter's initial detection and engagement disrupted the primary infiltration attempt, forcing Japanese troops into hasty defensive positions where they could be engaged by supporting machine guns. But the secondary infiltration succeeded in penetrating American lines, resulting in close-quarters combat that negated any technological advantages. Private Walsh took shrapnel from a Japanese grenade during the confused firefight that followed. Carter found himself operating the infrared system without a trained spotter, significantly reducing his effectiveness during subsequent engagements. The two-man team concept that had proven successful during initial operations became impossible to maintain as casualties mounted and replacement personnel lacked adequate training on the specialized equipment. By April 10, Carter's daily log reflected the evolving tactical situation. Japanese infiltration attempts continued, but had adapted to exploit infrared limitations. Weather conditions frequently reduced system effectiveness below acceptable levels. Equipment failures required increasing amounts of maintenance time. Personnel losses degraded team effectiveness. The technological edge that had seemed decisive during the first few nights was proving insufficient against determined and adaptive enemy forces. The broader implications extended beyond Carter's specific sector. Throughout the Okinawan defensive perimeter, infrared-equipped teams reported similar experiences. Initial tactical advantages diminished as enemy forces adapted their infiltration techniques. Weather and equipment reliability created operational gaps the Japanese forces learned to exploit. The revolutionary night vision capability remained effective, but required constant tactical evolution to maintain its advantage against increasingly sophisticated enemy responses. Yet, despite these limitations, the infrared carbine system continued to inflict disproportionate casualties on infiltrating forces. Japanese units that had operated with confidence during night operations now approached American positions with obvious reluctance. The psychological impact of technological surprise, while diminished, continued to influence enemy tactical decisions throughout the campaign. The statistics emerging from Okinawa's first 2 weeks painted a picture that defied conventional military logic. Intelligence officers at 10th Army headquarters struggled to reconcile the numbers with established patterns of Pacific warfare. Approximately 150 infrared carbines representing less than 0.1% of American small arms on the island were accounting for nearly 30% of confirmed Japanese casualties inflicted by rifle and carbine fire during night engagements. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, reviewing casualty reports from multiple sectors, found the disproportion almost impossible to believe. His staff had documented over 400 confirmed Japanese infiltrator deaths during the period from April 1 through April 15. Of these, approximately 120 could be directly attributed to infrared-equipped teams. The remaining casualties resulted from conventional weapons, machine guns, mortars, grenades, but even many of these engagements had been initiated by infrared detection and target designation. The industrial implications of this tactical success troubled military planners even more than the battlefield results themselves. Inland manufacturing had produced only 811 functional T3 carbines before contract termination, with fewer than 200 reaching the Pacific theater. The production bottlenecks that limited availability reflected deeper constraints in American manufacturing capacity for precision optical equipment and specialized electronics. Each infrared scope required hand-fitted components that could not be mass-produced using conventional Assembly line techniques. The optical elements demanded grinding and polishing tolerances measured in thousandth of an inch. Battery pack production required specialized chemical expertise and materials that competed with other military priorities. Lamp housing manufacturing consumed machine shop capacity needed for conventional weapons production. Carter experienced these supply constraints directly when his infrared lamp failed on April 13. The filament, stressed by repeated thermal cycling and weapon recoil, finally burned out during a critical engagement. Without replacement parts available at the company level, his carbine reverted to conventional operation until a technician from Division Ordnance could install a new lamp assembly 3 days later. During those 72 hours, Japanese infiltration attempts in his sector increased dramatically. The supply chain from Fort Belvoir to forward positions on Okinawa revealed additional vulnerabilities. Battery packs required regular replacement as lead-acid cells deteriorated under tropical conditions. Optical components needed constant cleaning supplies and replacement parts as humidity and combat damage took their toll. Specialized technical manuals and trained maintenance personnel remained scarce throughout the theater. Sergeant Miller documented the logistical burden in his daily reports. Each infrared equipped team required approximately 3 times the maintenance support of conventional rifle teams. Battery charging stations needed electrical power generation capacity that strained forward area capabilities. Spare parts inventory consumed transport space needed for ammunition and other critical supplies. Technical support personnel required specialized training that diverted resources from conventional weapons maintenance. The tactical effectiveness of the infrared carbine depended not just on the weapon itself, but on the entire system of detection, engagement, and support that surrounded it. Carter learned to position himself where the infrared beam could illuminate maximum area while remaining concealed from enemy observation. His machine gun crews adjusted their firing positions to engage targets designated by infrared detection. Mortar teams prepared predetermined fire missions based on likely infiltration routes identified through night observation. This integration multiplied the effectiveness of individual infrared weapons beyond their direct contribution to casualties. A single carbine detecting enemy movement at 70 yards could trigger responses from multiple supporting weapon systems, creating a lethal envelope that extended far beyond the range of the carbine itself. Japanese infiltrators who avoided direct engagement with infrared-equipped teams often found themselves exposed to machine gun or mortar fire that had been directed by night observation. Capabilities. The psychological impact on Japanese forces became evident through captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Infiltration teams that had operated with confidence throughout the Pacific campaign now approached American positions with obvious reluctance. Traditional Japanese night fighting doctrine assumed American blindness after dark, but this assumption no longer held true in sectors defended by infrared-equipped teams. Colonel Yahara's tactical assessments reflected growing Japanese concern about American night capabilities. His intelligence reports noted the correlation between infrared-equipped positions and infiltration failures, though Japanese forces had not yet identified the specific nature of American technological advantages. Yahara's response involved increasingly complex infiltration schemes designed to overwhelm or bypass suspected American observation positions. The weather patterns of mid-April created additional challenges for infrared operations. Okinawa's spring climate combined high humidity with frequent rainfall, conditions that severely degraded infrared performance. Carter learned to operate effectively in marginal Conditions: adjusting lamp power settings and repositioning equipment to minimize atmospheric interference. But extended periods of heavy rain or dense fog could render the system completely ineffective. Equipment reliability emerged as a critical factor in sustained operations. The T3 Carbine incorporated multiple complex systems, optical, electrical, and mechanical, each subject to failure. Under combat conditions, Carter's experience with lamp filament burnout was typical of problems encountered throughout the theater. Battery pack failures, optical misalignment, and mechanical damage from recoil stress created constant maintenance requirements. Training limitations became apparent as operations continued beyond the initial engagement period. The 5-day course at Fort Lewis provided basic operational knowledge, but could not anticipate the full range of challenges encountered in combat. Carter developed techniques through trial and error that should have been part of standardized doctrine. Positioning strategies, power management protocols, and maintenance procedures evolved through battlefield experience, rather than systematic training programs. The human cost of these technological advantages weighed heavily on operators like Carter. The responsibility of maintaining surveillance over approaches where Japanese infiltrators might threaten sleeping comrades created intense psychological pressure. Equipment failures during critical periods meant the difference between successful defense and casualties among friends. The burden of operating sophisticated equipment while under enemy fire demanded constant focus and technical competence. By April 20th, casualty reports from Carter's sector reflected the complex interplay between technological capability and tactical adaptation. His infrared-equipped team had confirmed kills against 28 Japanese infiltrators during the previous 3 weeks. Supporting weapons directed by infrared observation had accounted for additional casualties difficult to quantify precisely. But Japanese adaptation had also resulted in successful infiltrations when weather conditions or equipment failures created gaps in surveillance. The broader strategic implications extended beyond immediate battlefield results. American industry's ability to produce sophisticated night vision equipment in meaningful quantities remained limited by manufacturing constraints and competing military priorities. The success of infrared carbines on Okinawa demonstrated the potential of night vision technology while highlighting the industrial capacity required to field such systems on a larger scale. Carter's daily log entries during this period reflected both pride in the system's capabilities and frustration with its limitations. The technological edge that had seemed revolutionary during initial operations was proving to be one factor among many in the complex equation of night combat. Effective employment required constant adaptation, technical expertise, and logistical support that strained military resources throughout the theater. The infrared carbine had not won the battle for Okinawa, but it had fundamentally altered the tactical balance of night fighting in ways that would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. By June 15, the character of night fighting on Okinawa had fundamentally changed from the desperate infiltration battles of April. Japanese forces, decimated by weeks of attrition and increasingly constrained by American firepower, had largely abandoned the large-scale night infiltration tactics that had defined their defensive strategy. The sugarcane fields southeast of Shuri, once prime infiltration routes, now lay mostly quiet during the dark hours. Carter maintained his vigilant watch through the infrared scope, but the targets that had appeared nightly during the campaign's opening weeks now materialized only sporadically. Lieutenant General Ushiima's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The 32nd Army's original Strength of approximately 110,000 troops had been reduced to fewer than 30,000. Effective combatants through relentless American bombardment and ground assault. The cave complexes and fortified positions that had anchored Japanese defensive plans were systematically destroyed by flamethrowers, demolition charges, and sustained artillery fire. Most critically for Carter's mission, the disciplined infiltration teams that had posed such a significant threat during April had been largely eliminated or dispersed. The transformation was evident in the operational tempo of infrared-equipped teams throughout the American defensive perimeter. During the campaign's first 2 weeks, Carter's section had engaged Japanese infiltrators almost nightly, sometimes multiple times per evening. By mid-June, several nights passed without any contact. When infiltration attempts did occur, they typically involved small groups of desperate soldiers seeking escape routes rather than coordinated tactical operations designed to inflict casualties on American forces. Carter used this reduced operational pressure to refine techniques that would have been impossible to develop during the intense fighting of early April. He learned to extend battery life by cycling power more efficiently, maintaining surveillance capability throughout extended night watches. Positioning strategies evolved to maximize the infrared beam's effectiveness while minimizing exposure to Japanese observation during daylight reconnaissance. Equipment maintenance became routine rather than emergency. Repair work conducted under enemy fire. The tactical lessons emerging from 3 months of infrared carbine employment began filtering through American military doctrine development. After-action reports from Okinawa documented specific techniques that maximize system effectiveness while mitigating inherent limitations. The two-man team concept proved essential. One operator focused on surveillance while a spotter managed communications and provided security. Integration with supporting weapons multiplied the infrared carbines' tactical impact beyond its direct contribution to casualties. Weather management protocols developed through battlefield experience rather than formal training. Operators learned to adjust lamp power settings for atmospheric conditions, position equipment to minimize reflection interference and coordinate with conventional weapons when infrared effectiveness dropped below acceptable levels. These adaptations documented in unit reports would influence the design and employment of subsequent night vision systems. On June 18, Carter participated in what would prove to be one of the final significant night engagements of the Okinawa campaign. Japanese forces, increasingly desperate as their defensive positions collapsed, attempted a coordinated withdrawal through American lines under cover of darkness. The operation involved approximately 60 soldiers moving in small groups through terrain that Carter's section had monitored for nearly 3 months. The engagement demonstrated both the maturity of Carter's tactical skills and the limitations that continued to constrain infrared operations. Through his scope, he detected the first withdrawal group at maximum range, approximately 70 yards out in clear weather conditions. Rather than engaging immediately, he tracked their movement pattern while coordinating with supporting machine gun and mortar teams. When the Japanese entered a predetermined killing zone at 50 yards, Carter initiated engagement with a precision that would have been impossible during the chaotic fighting of early April. The results reflected months of tactical evolution. Carter's initial burst dropped the lead soldier, triggering immediate response from supporting weapons that had been positioned and briefed based on detailed knowledge of likely approach routes. The coordination between infrared detection and conventional firepower created an engagement envelope that eliminated 12 Japanese soldiers within 30 seconds while preventing any from reaching American positions. Yet, the engagement also highlighted persistent limitations. Rain began falling midway through the action, reducing Carter's effective observation range and creating false reflections that masked additional movement. Battery power carefully managed throughout the night dropped below optimal levels during the extended surveillance period. Equipment that had seemed revolutionary 3 months earlier now felt familiar but fragile, requiring constant attention to maintain operational effectiveness. The broader strategic impact of infrared carbine employment became clear through casualty analysis conducted as the Okinawa campaign concluded. Official records credited infrared-equipped teams with confirmed kills against approximately 450 Japanese soldiers during the 3-month period from April through June. Supporting weapons directed by infrared observation accounted for additional casualties that could not be precisely quantified, but likely exceeded the direct contribution of the carbines themselves. More significantly, the psychological and tactical effects extended far beyond casualty statistics. Japanese night infiltration, a tactical advantage that had troubled American commanders throughout the Pacific campaign, had been essentially neutralized in sectors defended by infrared-equipped teams. The confidence that American infantry gained from technological superiority during night operations influenced tactical decisions and unit morale in ways that traditional metrics could not measure. Carter's personal experience reflected the human dimension of this technological transition. The steady nerves and technical competence required to operate sophisticated equipment under combat conditions had been developed through months of trial and error. The responsibility of maintaining surveillance over approaches where enemy infiltrators might threaten sleeping comrades had created psychological pressures that PCM training could not anticipate. The burden of proving that new technology could save lives had rested on soldiers who received minimal specialized training and operated with equipment that pushed the boundaries of 1940s manufacturing capability. As the Okinawan campaign entered its final phase, Carter documented his experiences in a detailed after-action diary that would contribute to post-war evaluation of infrared weapon systems. His observations covered technical performance, tactical employment, logistical requirements, and training needs that formal military reports often overlooked. The practical knowledge gained through 3 months of combat employment provided insights that would influence American night vision development for decades. The industrial lessons were equally significant. The success of infrared carbines on Okinawa had been achieved with fewer than 200 weapons produced under emergency wartime conditions. Scaling production to equip larger units would require manufacturing capabilities that did not exist in 1945. The specialized components, precision assembly requirements, and technical support infrastructure necessary for widespread deployment represented industrial challenges that extended far beyond immediate tactical success. On June 22, as organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa finally collapsed, Carter powered down his infrared system for the final time in combat. The green world that had revealed enemy movement through 3 months of night fighting faded to black. The technological advantage that had seemed so revolutionary during those first desperate nights in April had become routine, familiar, essential to operations that had fundamentally altered the tactical balance of infantry warfare. The night no longer belonged to the enemy, but neither did it belong entirely to American forces. It had become contested ground where technology, tactics, and human skill determined outcomes that influenced the survival of individual soldiers and the success of military operations on a scale that few innovations in military history had achieved with such limited resources and brief development time.